The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park as Officer Derek Williams drove his patrol car slowly down the winding path. It was one of those quiet Tuesday afternoons where nothing much happened, and Derek preferred it that way. Less paperwork, less hassle, and more time to think about his plans for the weekend. Derek had been a cop for 12 years now, and he thought he knew every type of person who came through this park. Joggers in their bright athletic wear, families with screaming kids, teenagers trying to skip school, and the occasional homeless person looking for a place to rest. He had his routine down pat, and he liked keeping things predictable. As he rounded the corner near the duck pond, something caught his eye. A black man in a dark suit was sitting alone on one of the wooden benches, reading what looked like a stack of papers. Derek slowed his car and studied the scene more carefully. The man appeared to be in his 30s, well-dressed and completely absorbed in whatever he was reading. Something about the situation bothered Derek, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the fact that the man was wearing a suit in the middle of the afternoon when most people were at work. Maybe it was because he was sitting in a part of the park that usually stayed empty during weekday hours. Or maybe it was something else entirely. The man on the bench was actually Agent David Thompson, though Derek had no way of knowing that. David had been with the FBI for 8 years, and today he was taking a much-needed break from a complex investigation that had been consuming his life for the past 3 months. He'd been working on a case involving corruption in local government, and the paperwork was starting to make his eyes hurt. David had chosen this particular bench because it was quiet and peaceful. The sound of ducks splashing in the nearby pond helped him think more clearly than the stuffy office back at headquarters. He was reviewing witness statements and financial records, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to get more complicated every day. Derek pulled his patrol car over to the curb and sat there for a moment, watching. In his mind, he was already building a story about why this man was really here. People in expensive suits didn't just sit in parks reading papers unless they were up to something. Maybe he was dealing drugs. Maybe he was casing the area for a robbery. Maybe he was waiting for someone who wasn't supposed to be met in public. The truth was much simpler than Derek imagined. David had grabbed a sandwich from the deli near his office and decided to eat lunch somewhere other than his desk for once. His supervisor had been pushing the entire team to take proper breaks, reminding them that burned-out agents made mistakes, and mistakes in their line of work could be dangerous. David flipped through another page of the financial records he was reviewing. The case he was working on involved several city officials who had been taking bribes in exchange for favorable contracts. It was the kind of slow, methodical investigation that required patience and attention to detail. Not the dramatic car chases and shootouts that people saw in movies, but important work that helped keep communities safe from corruption. Derek finally made his decision. He turned off his engine and stepped out of the patrol car. Something told him he needed to check this situation out. In his experience, when something looked out of place, it usually was out of place. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, even when other people told him he was being too suspicious. As Derek walked across the grass toward the bench, he tried to appear casual and friendly. He'd approach the man with a simple question, maybe ask if everything was okay and see how he responded. People who were up to no good usually gave themselves away pretty quickly when they talked to a police officer. David noticed the approaching officer in his peripheral vision, but didn't look up immediately. He was used to seeing police in public spaces, and he assumed the officer was just doing a routine patrol. David continued reading, making notes in the margins of one of the documents with a pen he'd borrowed from the receptionist back at the office. Derek was now close enough to see that the papers the man was reading looked official, with lots of small print and what appeared to be legal language. This made him even more suspicious. In his mind, regular people didn't sit in parks reading legal documents unless they were planning something they shouldn't be planning. What Derek didn't realize was that David was actually reviewing evidence that could potentially put several corrupt officials behind bars. The documents contained bank records, email communications, and witness testimonies that painted a clear picture of bribery and abuse of power. David had spent weeks gathering this evidence, working with informants and following paper trails that led through shell companies and offshore accounts. David finally looked up as the officer approached his bench. He offered a polite nod and a slight smile, the kind of greeting any normal person might give to a police officer in a public park. He had no reason to be concerned. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and he had proper identification if needed. Derek studied the man's face carefully, looking for signs of nervousness or guilt. The man seemed calm enough, but Derek had learned that some of the best criminals were also the best actors. He decided to start with a simple, friendly approach and see where the conversation led. The afternoon breeze rustled the papers in David's hands, and he had to grip them more tightly to keep them from blowing away. A family of ducks waddled past the bench, probably hoping for some breadcrumbs or other treats. In the distance, a few joggers made their way along the paved path that circled the pond. This was supposed to be David's quiet moment, his chance to clear his head and review important case materials in a peaceful setting. He had no idea that his simple decision to eat lunch in the park was about to turn into something much more complicated and potentially dangerous for everyone involved. Derek took a deep breath and prepared to start what he assumed would be a routine conversation with a suspicious individual. He had no way of knowing that he was about to make one of the biggest mistakes of his career. Derek stopped a few feet away from the bench and cleared his throat to get the man's attention. When David looked up from his papers, Derek put on what he thought was a friendly smile, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Afternoon," Derek said, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. "Beautiful day to be in the park." David nodded politely and replied, "Yes, it really is. Perfect weather for getting some fresh air." Something in Derek's expression shifted as he heard David's voice. The man spoke clearly and professionally without any accent that Derek could detect. This somehow made Derek even more suspicious. In his twisted thinking, he expected certain people to sound a certain way, and when they didn't match his prejudiced expectations, it only confirmed that something was wrong. "Mind if I ask what brings you out here today?" Derek asked, taking a step closer to the bench. His tone was still attempting to sound casual, but there was an edge to it that David immediately picked up on. David had been trained to read people and situations quickly. Something about this officer's body language and tone of voice was setting off alarm bells in his head. Still, he remained calm and answered honestly. "Just taking a lunch break," David said, gesturing to the empty sandwich wrapper beside him on the bench. "I worked nearby and thought it would be nice to eat outside for once instead of at my desk." Derek's eyes moved to the stack of papers in David's hands. "That's quite a bit of reading material for a lunch break. What kind of work do you do?" David felt his muscles tense slightly. The question itself wasn't unreasonable, but the way it was asked felt more like an interrogation than a friendly conversation. He chose his words carefully, knowing that his cover story needed to be simple and believable. "I work in administration," David said. "Government paperwork mostly." "Pretty boring stuff, really." This answer seemed to make Derek even more suspicious. In his mind, he was connecting dots that didn't actually connect. A well-dressed black man reading official-looking documents in an empty part of the park, claiming to work in government administration. Derek's prejudiced thinking told him this was probably some kind of scam or illegal activity. "Government work, huh?" Derek said, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "Which department?" David realized that this conversation was heading in a dangerous direction. He could feel the officer's hostility growing with each exchange, and he knew from experience that situations like this could escalate quickly. His FBI training had taught him to de-escalate when possible, but he also knew that some people were determined to find trouble whether it existed or not. "Look, officer," David said, keeping his voice calm and respectful, "I'm just trying to enjoy my lunch break. Is there something specific I can help you with?" Derek didn't like being questioned, even politely. In his mind, he was the one with the badge and the authority, and regular citizens should answer his questions without asking questions of their own. This response only convinced him further that the man was hiding something. "I'll ask the questions here," Derek said, his hand moving closer to his handcuffs. "I need to see some identification." David knew he had every right to refuse this request since he wasn't doing anything illegal, but he also knew that refusing would only make the situation worse. He slowly reached in his jacket pocket for his wallet, making sure to move carefully so the officer wouldn't think he was reaching for a weapon. As David pulled out his driver's license, Derek stepped even closer. When David handed over the ID, Derek studied it carefully, looking for any signs that it might be fake. The license looked legitimate, but Derek was still convinced that something wasn't right about this whole situation. David Thompson, Derek read aloud. Says here you live over on Maple Street. That's pretty far from here. What brings you all the way across town to eat lunch in this particular park? David was growing more concerned by the minute. The officer's questions were becoming more aggressive and personal, and there was no legitimate reason for this level of scrutiny. David had done nothing wrong, but he could see that facts weren't going to matter much to this particular officer. I like this park, David answered honestly. It's quiet here and I can think clearly. Sometimes I drive a few extra minutes to find a peaceful place to take a break. Derek handed the license back with obvious reluctance. He was frustrated that he couldn't find anything obviously wrong with the identification, but his gut told him that something was still off about this situation. In his prejudiced mind, he was convinced that this man didn't belong in this neighborhood, in this park or in a suit that expensive. These papers, Derek said, pointing at the documents David was still holding. Mind if I take a look at what you're reading? This was the moment David knew things were about to get much worse. The documents he was carrying contained sensitive information related to his FBI investigation. If this officer saw the wrong thing, it could compromise months of careful work and potentially put informants in danger. I'm sorry, but those are private work documents, David said firmly but politely. I'm not comfortable sharing confidential paperwork. Derek's face flushed red with anger. In his mind, refusing to show the papers was basically an admission of guilt. He was convinced now that he'd stumbled onto something big, and his ego was driving him forward even though his training should have told him to back off. Private documents, huh? Derek said, his voice rising. Seems pretty suspicious to me that someone would be reading confidential government paperwork in a public park. Maybe you're not supposed to have those documents at all. David could see where this was heading, and he knew he had to make a decision. He could reveal his FBI credentials and end this confrontation immediately, but doing so might compromise his investigation. Several months of careful work could be ruined if word got out that an FBI agent was working in the area. Officer, I understand you're just doing your job, David said, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm sitting on a public bench in a public park during my lunch break. I have every right to be here. Derek was past the point of listening to reason. He'd convinced himself that he was dealing with a criminal, and nothing David could say was going to change his mind. In Derek's twisted thinking, the man's calm demeanor and articulate responses were just proof that he was a sophisticated criminal rather than an innocent person. Stand up, Derek ordered, his hand moving to his handcuffs. I think we need to continue this conversation down at the station. David felt his heart rate increase, but his training kept him outwardly calm. He knew that resisting would only make things worse, even though he had every legal right to walk away. Sometimes the best strategy was to let the situation play out and deal with the consequences later. On what grounds? David asked quietly. Suspicious behavior, Derek replied, pulling out his handcuffs, and failure to cooperate with a police investigation. As Derek moved closer with the handcuffs, David made a mental note of everything that was happening. He would need to remember every detail for the reports he would have to write later. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a pattern of behavior that needed to be documented and addressed. David stood up slowly from the bench, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. He knew that any sudden motion could be misinterpreted and make an already bad situation much worse. The stack of papers remained on the bench where he'd been sitting, and he made sure to keep his eyes on them as Derek approached with the handcuffs. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Derek ordered, his voice full of authority that he clearly enjoyed wielding. David complied without argument, though every instinct in his body was telling him to resist this unlawful arrest. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he reminded himself that sometimes the best way to fight injustice was to let it reveal itself completely before taking action. This is unnecessary, officer, David said calmly as Derek tightened the cuffs. I've done nothing wrong and you have no legal grounds for this arrest. Derek ignored the comment and reached for his radio. Unit 47 to dispatch, he said with obvious satisfaction in his voice. I need a transport unit to Riverside Park. I've got a suspicious individual in custody. The radio crackled back with a response. Copy that, Unit 47. What's the nature of the offense? Derek paused for a moment, realizing that he would have to explain his actions to his supervisor later. Suspicious behavior and failure to comply with a lawful investigation, he replied, using the vague language that officers sometimes employed when they knew their grounds were shaky. While they waited for backup, Derek gathered up the papers from the bench. David watched him handle the sensitive documents, knowing that Derek had no legal right to search through them without a warrant. Each page that Derek flipped through represented hours of careful investigative work, and David could only hope that nothing too revealing would catch the officer's attention. "Interesting reading material," Derek said as he skimmed through the financial records and legal documents. Most of the technical language meant nothing to him, but he could see official letterheads and what looked like bank statements. In his suspicious mind, this only confirmed that he'd caught someone involved in some kind of financial crime. David remained silent, knowing that anything he said could potentially make the situation worse. He was mentally preparing for what would happen at the police station, thinking through the procedures and protocols that would protect both his investigation and his rights. A second patrol car arrived within 10 minutes, and Officer Janet Rodriguez stepped out. She was a 15-year veteran of the force who had seen her share of questionable arrests over the years. As she approached Derek and David, she immediately sensed that something about this situation didn't feel right. "What do we have here?" Officer Rodriguez asked Derek, studying David's professional appearance and calm demeanor. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park," Derek explained, puffing out his chest with pride. "He was reading confidential documents and wouldn't cooperate when I asked him questions about what he was doing here." Rodriguez frowned. "What kind of suspicious behavior?" Derek realized that his explanation sounded thin when he had to repeat it to another officer. "Well, he was just sitting there reading these papers, and when I asked him about it, he got defensive and wouldn't show me what he was reading." Rodriguez looked at David, who met her eyes with a calm, steady gaze. In her experience, people who were actually guilty of something usually looked nervous or angry when they were arrested. This man looked like someone who was cooperating under protest, but wasn't particularly worried about the outcome. "Has he been read his rights?" Rodriguez asked. Derek's face reddened slightly. In his eagerness to make the arrest, he'd forgotten this basic requirement. "I was just about to do that," he said quickly. As Derek began reciting the Miranda warning from memory, David listened carefully and acknowledged that he understood each of his rights. When Derek finished, David spoke for the first time since being handcuffed. "I'd like to make my phone call as soon as we get to the station," David said clearly. Derek nodded, though he was already planning to make David wait as long as possible before allowing the call. In his mind, making suspects sweat was part of the process of getting them to confess to whatever they were really up to. The ride to the police station was tense and quiet. David sat in the back of Derek's patrol car, studying the officer's behavior and making mental notes about everything that had happened. Rodriguez followed in her own vehicle, still feeling uneasy about the whole situation. At the station, Derek walked David through the booking process with obvious satisfaction. He fingerprinted him, took his photograph, and filled out the arrest report with creative language that made the incident sound more serious than it actually was. David cooperated with everything, knowing that resistance would only give Derek more ammunition to use against him. "So what's your story?" Derek asked as he finished the paperwork. "What were you really doing in that park with all those documents?" David looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'd like to make my phone call now." Derek's jaw tightened with frustration. He'd been hoping to get some kind of confession, or at least a more detailed story that he could use to justify the arrest. Instead, the suspect was remaining calm and following proper procedure, which somehow made Derek even more suspicious. "Fine," Derek said, leading David to a phone in the booking area. "Make it quick." David picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, a voice answered on the other end. "This is Agent Thompson," David said calmly. "Badge number 4792. I need to speak with Supervisor Chen immediately." Derek's head snapped up at the word agent, but he couldn't hear the other side of the conversation clearly enough to understand what was being said. "I'm currently in custody at the Riverside Police Station," David continued. "The arresting officer is Derek Williams, badge number 237. I need someone here within the hour." David hung up the phone and turned back to Derek, who was staring at him with confusion and growing concern. "Agent?" Derek asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What kind of agent?" David simply smiled and said, "I think you're about to find out." Meanwhile, At FBI headquarters across town, Supervisor Lisa Chen was already reaching for her jacket and car keys. She'd been David's supervisor for 3 years, and she knew him well enough to understand that if he was calling from a police station, something had gone very wrong. Chen grabbed David's credentials from the secure file cabinet and headed for the door. She had a feeling this was going to be a very interesting afternoon, and not in a good way. Back at the police station, Derek was trying to convince himself that David was just bluffing. Plenty of criminals claimed to be agents or lawyers or other important people when they got arrested. But something about the way David had made that phone call was making Derek very nervous. Officer Rodriguez approached Derek at his desk. "Hey, what did you say this guy was arrested for again?" Derek looked up from his paperwork, sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "Suspicious behavior. Reading documents in the park." Rodriguez shook her head. "That's not really a crime, Derek. You know that, right?" Derek's stomach began to sink as he realized that his perfect arrest might not be as perfect as he'd thought. 53 minutes after David made his phone call, the front doors of the Riverside police station opened with purpose. Supervisor Lisa Chen walked in wearing a crisp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that immediately commanded attention. Her stride was confident and professional, the kind that made everyone in the room instinctively understand that she was someone important. Desk Sergeant Mike O'Brien looked up from his computer as she approached the front counter. He'd been working the desk for 22 years and had developed a good sense for reading people. This woman had the bearing of someone with serious authority, and the look on her face suggested she wasn't here for a friendly visit. "I'm here regarding the arrest of David Thompson," Chen said, placing her briefcase on the counter and opening it to reveal an official FBI identification. "I'm Supervisor Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Sergeant O'Brien felt his blood pressure spike as he stared at the gold badge and official credentials. In all his years on the job, he'd never had an FBI supervisor show up to claim someone from their holding cells. This was the kind of situation that usually meant major trouble for everyone involved. Let me get the arresting officer," O'Brien stammered, reaching for his phone. His hands were shaking slightly as he dialed Derek's extension. "Williams, you need to get down to the front desk immediately," O'Brien said when Derek picked up. "And bring all the paperwork for that Thompson arrest." Derek's stomach dropped. He'd been sitting at his desk for the past hour, trying to convince himself that David's phone call had been a bluff. But the tone in O'Brien's voice told him that his worst fears were about to come true. Chen stood patiently at the counter, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. She was already mentally preparing the reports she would have to file and the conversations she would have to have with her superiors about this incident. The FBI took civil rights violations very seriously, especially when they involved their own agents. Derek appeared at the front desk within 2 minutes, clutching the arrest paperwork in his sweaty hands. When he saw Chen's FBI credentials displayed on the counter, his face went pale and his knees felt weak. "Officer Williams?" Chen asked, though she already knew the answer from Derek's obvious distress. "I'm here about the arrest of Agent David Thompson." Derek's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. "Agent?" he finally managed to croak. Chen pulled out David's official FBI identification and badge, setting them on the counter next to her own credentials. "Agent Thompson has been with the Bureau for 8 years. He's currently assigned to a federal investigation, and he was conducting official business when you arrested him." Derek stared at the badge and identification, his mind racing as he tried to process what this meant. The confident, well-dressed man he'd arrested wasn't a criminal at all. He was a federal agent, and Derek had just made the biggest mistake of his career. I didn't know," Derek whispered, though even as he said it, he realized how weak his excuse sounded. He hadn't arrested David because he thought he was a criminal. He'd arrested him because of his own prejudices and assumptions. "What exactly were the grounds for this arrest?" Chen asked, her voice calm but demanding. She picked up the arrest report from the counter and began reading Derek's account of the incident. Derek swallowed hard. He was acting suspicious in the park, reading documents and not cooperating with my investigation. Chen looked up from the report with raised eyebrows. Not cooperating how? Well, he wouldn't show me the papers he was reading, Derek admitted, realizing how ridiculous this sounded when he had to explain it to an FBI supervisor. The papers he was reading, Chen said slowly, were classified federal documents related to an ongoing investigation. Agent Thompson was absolutely correct not to show them to you. In fact, he would have been violating federal law if he had. The room seemed to spin around Derek as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. Not only had he arrested an innocent person, but he'd arrested a federal agent who was working on an important case. Even worse, he'd potentially compromised a federal investigation by detaining the agent and confiscating his case materials. Sergeant O'Brien was frantically trying to figure out what procedures to follow in a situation like this. He'd never had to deal with the wrongful arrest of a federal agent, and he was pretty sure this was going to require immediate notification of the chief of police. "Where is Agent Thompson now?" Chen asked. "He's in holding cell number 3, O'Brien replied, already reaching for the keys. "I'll release him immediately." Chen nodded. "I'll also need all of his personal effects and the documents that were confiscated during the arrest." Derek's hands shook as he retrieved David's belongings from the property room. The stack of papers that had seemed so suspicious an hour ago now looked like what they actually were: routine case files that any federal agent might review during a lunch break. When the holding cell door opened, David stepped out looking exactly as calm and composed as he had in the park. He straightened his tie, accepted his belongings from Derek without a word, and walked over to where Chen was waiting. "Are you all right?" Chen asked quietly. David nodded. "I'm fine, though we may have a bigger problem on our hands than just a bad arrest." Chen understood immediately what he meant. The incident in the park hadn't happened in a vacuum. It was part of a pattern of behavior that suggested serious problems within the local police department, problems that might be related to the corruption case David was already investigating. Derek stood frozen near the holding cells, watching as the 2 FBI agents spoke in low voices. He could see his career crashing down around him, and he knew that this incident would follow him for the rest of his life. Officer Rodriguez appeared, beside Derek, having heard about the situation through the station grapevine. "Derek," she said quietly, "what were you thinking?" Derek couldn't answer because he didn't have a good answer. He'd been thinking with his prejudices instead of his training, and now everyone was going to pay the price for his mistake. Chief of Police Robert Hayes burst through the station doors, having been called at home by a panicked dispatcher. When he saw the FBI credentials on the front counter and the serious expressions on everyone's faces, he knew immediately that this was going to be a career-defining crisis for his department. "What's the situation?" Hayes asked, though he was already dreading the answer. Chen turned to face the chief with a professional but unmistakably stern expression. "Chief Hayes, we need to have a very serious conversation about what happened here today." Derek watched as his supervisor and the FBI began what he knew would be a very difficult discussion about his actions and their consequences. In the space of one afternoon, a simple lunch break in the park had turned into a federal incident that would have far-reaching implications for everyone involved. As David and Chen prepared to leave the station, David looked back at Derek one more time. There was no anger in his expression, but there was something far worse: disappointment in a system that was supposed to protect and serve everyone equally. The meeting in Chief Hayes' office lasted 3 hours and involved more people than Derek had ever seen crammed into that small space. Besides the Chief David and Supervisor Chen, there was also the department's internal affairs investigator, a representative from the city attorney's office, and a federal prosecutor who had been called in to assess potential civil rights violations. Derek sat in a chair against the wall, no longer a participant in the discussion but rather the subject of it. His union representative had arrived an hour into the meeting, but even the experienced lawyer looked grim as the conversation continued. "Let me make sure I understand the timeline correctly," the federal prosecutor was saying as she reviewed the incident report. Officer Williams approached Agent Thompson without any evidence of criminal activity, demanded to see identification, searched through classified federal documents, and then arrested him when he appropriately refused to share confidential materials. Chief Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That appears to be an accurate summary of events." The prosecutor made several notes on her legal pad. And this all occurred while Agent Thompson was conducting official federal business related to an ongoing investigation. David spoke up for the first time in an hour. That's correct. Though I should mention that my investigation wasn't originally focused on the police department. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. Chen knew what he was about to say, and she could see the wheels turning in the prosecutor's mind. What do you mean by that? The prosecutor asked. David pulled out a folder from his briefcase and set it on the chief's desk. I've been investigating corruption in local government contracting. However, today's incident has raised some questions about whether that corruption might extend into law enforcement. The chief's face went pale. What kind of questions? The kind that require us to look more closely at patterns of behavior, arrest records, and complaint histories, David replied diplomatically. Derek felt sick to his stomach as he realized that his actions had just opened up his entire department to federal scrutiny. What had started as a simple arrest was now threatening to become a comprehensive investigation into police practices. The internal affairs investigator, Lieutenant Patricia Barnes, had been quietly reviewing Derek's personnel file during the meeting. What she'd found wasn't encouraging. Officer Williams has received 4 formal complaints in the past 2 years, Barnes announced to the room. 3 of them involved allegations of racial profiling. All 4 complaints were investigated and dismissed. Dismissed by whom? The prosecutor asked. Barnes hesitated before answering. By Sergeant Murphy, Williams' direct supervisor. Chen and David exchanged a meaningful look. Sergeant Murphy was one of the names that had come up in their corruption investigation, though they hadn't yet established a clear connection to any illegal activity. The meeting continued with discussions of procedures, protocols, and potential consequences. Derek's arrest of David was clearly unlawful, but the bigger question was whether it represented an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of misconduct. 2 weeks later, Derek found himself sitting across from a federal investigator in a windowless room at the FBI field office. His union lawyer sat beside him, occasionally whispering advice that Derek was too distracted to fully absorb. Officer Williams, the investigator said, "We've reviewed your arrest records for the past 5 years. Would you like to explain why 87% of your arrests involve people of color, despite the fact that your patrol area is only 43% minority?" Derek had no good answer for this question, just as he'd had no good answers for any of the other questions he'd been asked over the past 2 weeks. The statistics painted a clear picture of bias in his policing, and there was no way to explain that away. The investigation expanded rapidly.
Federal agents interviewed Derek's colleagues, reviewed his arrest reports, and spoke with dozens of people who had been stopped or arrested by him over the years.
What they found was a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been ignored or covered up by his supervisors. Meanwhile, David's original corruption investigation was also producing results. The federal scrutiny triggered by Derek's arrest had led to the discovery of several questionable contracts and financial arrangements involving city officials and police department leaders. Sergeant Murphy was arrested 3 months after Derek's encounter with David in the park. The charges included bribery, conspiracy, and violation of civil rights under color of law. It turned out that Murphy had been taking payments to ignore or dismiss complaints against certain officers, including Derek. Derek himself faced federal charges for violating David's civil rights. The case against him was strong, supported by video evidence from park security cameras and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed the arrest. The trial lasted 6 days. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that his client had simply made a mistake in judgment, but the prosecution presented evidence of a long pattern of discriminatory behavior that made the incident in the park look like part of a deliberate strategy rather than an isolated error. David testified on the 3rd day of the trial. He spoke calmly and professionally about what had happened in the park, making it clear that Derek's actions had not only violated his rights, but had also potentially compromised an important federal investigation. "Agent Thompson," the prosecutor asked, "in your opinion, was Officer Williams' behavior motivated by racial bias?" David paused thoughtfully before answering. "Based on my training and experience and considering the totality of the circumstances, I believe that Officer Williams approached me not because of any observable criminal activity, but because of assumptions he made based on my race. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Derek was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and permanent removal from law enforcement. Chief Hayes resigned 2 weeks after Derek's conviction, citing the need for new leadership to rebuild community trust. The entire police department underwent federal oversight, with new training programs, revised policies, and regular monitoring by civil rights organizations. Officer Rodriguez, who had witnessed Derek's arrest of David, was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of implementing the new community policing initiatives. She often thought about that afternoon in the park and how one officer's prejudices had ultimately led to positive changes for the entire department. David completed his corruption investigation successfully, with 7 city officials ultimately convicted and sentenced to prison terms. The case became a model for how federal and local agencies could work together to root out corruption and protect civil rights. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon 6 months later, David returned to Riverside Park for lunch. He sat on the same bench where Derek had arrested him, reading case files for a new investigation and enjoying the peaceful sounds of the duck pond. This time, when a police officer approached him, it was Officer Rodriguez making her regular patrol rounds. She nodded politely and continued on her way, a simple interaction that represented how much had changed since that day when prejudice and power had collided with justice and accountability. The ducks still splashed in the pond, families still brought their children to play, and joggers still made their rounds on the paved paths. But now the park felt safer for everyone, protected by officers who understood that their job was to serve all citizens equally, regardless of the color of their skin or the assumptions that prejudice might create. Derek's story became a cautionary tale used in police training programs across the country, a reminder that badges and uniforms come with the responsibility to treat every person with dignity and respect. Sometimes the most important lessons are learned through the most painful mistakes, and sometimes justice requires that those mistakes carry serious consequences. The park bench where it all began remained unchanged, a quiet witness to the truth that justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of prevailing when good people refuse to accept that wrong is right.